I was talking yesterday to somebody about how you stay in a hotel, you can't open the window. But actually, the future of the world is in places like India, where are changing more than any country has ever changed.
It's nice to have you on the show. So, could you tell us about who you are and what you do?
Hi, great to meet you. Great to be here. And I am an architect, and I've also made various TV programs. And I'm also, I guess, a part time academic and book writer and all sorts of things relating to architecture.
So, is this your studio in the background?
This is my studio in the background, my home studio, very low key and homemade.
All right. So, what kind of architecture do you do? Because I've seen it's a bit different compared to all the other guys in the marketplace.
It's a really interesting question. What sort of architecture do I do? And I guess I try and work in a way that's very authentic. I think, in a way, what I'm really interested in is just using what's around me to make a building. And, historically, we worked in this manner. And I think then when we think about modernism, one of the things that happened was that we thought we could make a building that was the same building anywhere. And, obviously we defined it as something called an international style. And as time goes by, I think many of us are sort of wondering, how do we use buildings to tell stories about places and tell stories about people in a way that buildings used to? So more than anything, I think I work in a manner that tries to tell stories about the places that they're in and the people that make them.
Yeah, I agree. Especially like modern architecture, it's like a human cage, you could say. So,
Yes, I think that modern architecture clearly is extraordinary. And in any way, in no way am I directly critical of what happened and when, because I think there was a real need to wipe the slate clean. And like many art practices, music, painting, architecture really needed to go back to zero in a way and to establish some sort of principles with a new machine age and a new way of looking at things in much the same way that Picasso was doing with painting and various writers were doing with reinventing the way they told stories. And I think modernism served us incredibly well. But I think one of the things that I guess we think about is, if you look at the history of the world, when we go to any place, what we see is the history of the world told through buildings. And typically, buildings were made out of things that came from somewhere that was very local and very specific to a place. And one of the things that I think we explored during modernism, during the sort of first half of the last century, was what if we made a building that could be anywhere? And I think that's still a really interesting idea. But I think well, I'm not for a minute thinking that we go back to pre-modern ways of doing things, because I'm really interested in the contemporary world. But I'm really interested to understand what role place plays in contemporary architecture and how difference can be established when actually the world is shrinking in so many ways. I mean, I sort of feel very much that I am a citizen of the world. I have no allegiance to necessarily one particular country or region from a cultural perspective. But I think difference based on geology, geography, material, people, climate is super interesting.
did you start off your career with modernism, or were you always into this?
When I started, I studied in Australia with a guy called Glenn Murcutt, who is an amazing architect, and he won the Pritzker Prize. And Glenn gave me an amazing roadmap, because Glenn Murcutt made very modest buildings that, in some ways, were high modernism. They were very simple buildings that were derived from a interest in Mies van der Rohe and the formal, I guess, purity that the modern movement sort of implied, rigid, logical plan. And yet his buildings were highly specific to a place. And he used, wind patterns, sunlight, weather, climate to establish the sort of specific detail of how a building would knit into its place. Typically, that was through a section. So what Glenn would do was take a very, very simple plan and then begin to evolve it based on where it was, based on how much sun came in, how much wind was allowed to go through it, how much glare you needed to keep out, all of those things. So in a way, it was always a hybrid language that I was working with that was to do with some, I guess, formality based on an orthodoxy or a structure that was about simplicity and a formal way of establishing very simply a structural layout, married to an interest in place, climate, geology, geography, material, and locale. And I think over time, I moved from Australia. I came back and worked in the UK and Europe, and I guess what I've become more and more interested in, particularly through my teaching at the Architectural Association and at Hook Park, is what do you do if you just have what's around you, and what can you use if you just have what's here? And I like this sense that you just use what you have, and I think, what if you are a filmmaker and you only have an iPhone? What if you're somebody that's interested in music? You just have a kind of instrument you can make yourself. What if you just use what you have? And I think what it does is really force you to be very kind of inventive about what you have. And I sort of love this sense that there's kind of nothing you can do. It's like, what do you do if you just need to make shelter and these are the only things you've got? Sometimes things are abundant, sometimes less so. But I like this idea that just through what you have, it allows a way of seeing a place, I think.
If someone's living in like a kind of normal house, you could say, like four walls, that's it. How could they, how could they modify their own home to make it more connected with nature?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think that one of the things that I still think is possible in a dense city, and I think, most of us live in cities. More than 50% of the world is urbanized. Increasingly, people are moving to cities. And I think that's, in some senses, the greatest contribution to sustainability ever. We take pressure off the land, we live densely. And at the same time, what I think that doesn't need to suggest is that we cut ourselves off from nature. And I think one of the things that I enjoy most is knowing where I am in terms of the time of day, in terms of how the light comes in terms of where the wind is coming from. All of those kind of things are possible in a city. But I think also, I mean, to answer your question most directly, I would actually say something that sounds incredibly banal, which is make sure you can open a window. And I think, I was talking yesterday to somebody about how, you stay in a hotel, you can't open the window, and it isn't about the temperature of the air. It's about a kind of connection to the outside world. It's about hearing a bit of wind or hearing the way something is moved by wind or feeling a bit of wind on your skin or whatever it is. It's that connection to the outside world is much more than controlling temperature. And I think opening a window is one of the most direct ways that you can connect yourself to the outside world.
Why are you so passionate about this subject? Like, is there a particular reason about
I
nature
think,
and
good question. I think I always grew up around nature. My father was a kind of explorer. He went to Cambridge and then he went sledging for 3 years in the Antarctic, living, in a tent by himself, surveying glaciers and doing his PhD right down, in the southern hemisphere. And I think, in a way, he showed me that the world is an amazing place that you never need to be fearful of. And in a way, I spent a lot of my childhood with my father just being in nature, walking through nature and seeing nature and accepting it as just as part of me. And I never saw it as distinct from me. And, I grew up like that. And the holidays we had as kids were incredibly exposed to the elements. And we used to go to this place in Greece that's incredibly kind of raw and exposed to, the kind of the intensity of the weather. So it's on the west coast of an island off mainland Greece, where we still go now, and we're building a place there, in fact. And the sun was so bright, the wind was so strong, the waves were so big, and everything was defined by that place. The food you ate, what you did, whatever it was just defined by weather and season. And that, I think, was super interesting. But then I think, coming back to your question, partly that was my DNA I'm kind of talking about. But then when I went to uni in Sydney, and Glenn took what I found interesting about the language of architecture and the theory of architecture, which was, the formal sort of concerns and the dialogue within architecture, and then married it to the specifics of a place. He used the specifics of a place to make architecture. And I guess I found that a very kind of convincing way of making a building that was so much more interesting than talking about what shape it was and what color it was. And that, I suppose, was really or was really affecting in so many ways. And I guess, it's just somewhere I feel comfortable in. I feel at home in nature. We live in the middle of a huge woodland on a slope that feels like a piece of wilderness, and yet it's right next to or near a really interesting city, which is the city of Bath, which is a World Heritage Site, a Roman city, a Georgian city, a medieval city as well. And I like those two things. You can be surrounded by nature, and yet within 5 minutes you can be in the center of a kind of city. I like both. I love cities, but I also love nature.
You've done lots of TV shows and interviews such as this. Why do you do that? Like, is that another hobby of yours?
Why do I make TV shows? I think I make TV shows because I think part of architecture is talking about architecture. One of the reasons architects talk so much is their first idea is never their last idea. And you discover architecture through talking about it, through teasing it out, through trying to make sense of it. And what I really enjoyed about, say, making a show like The World's Most Extraordinary Homes was, how do I tell people about this building when, the way that you tell people about a building is not to go to a building and say, here's the front door, I'm going to go in, and here's the bedroom, and here's the living room, but actually to give them a sense of the building. How, if you have 15 minutes of screen time to tell a story of a building, how do you describe that? What is it that you do that builds a picture of this building in the mind of a viewer? And I loved the kind of immediacy of it. I loved turning up, knowing nothing about a building and having no script and just having to describe in a single take what was in front of me. So it would make sense of this to, thousands of people watching a show. And what I think I found interesting was that, but also it's so different in a way from making architecture, which is such a long process. A building takes years and years and years to make. Sometimes we do a building that takes 8 years, from start to finish. And, when you make a TV show, it's like, bang, that's it. The immediacy of it is so interesting. And I also love the travel. I love going to places and experiencing different places and seeing those places through the lens of different buildings that, like going to India and we saw Phil buildings there, each highly distinct, each amazing, each telling an extraordinary story about its place. And so that's one of the reasons I make TV is I like the dialogue, around it. And I like the challenge that it brings, which is very different from the challenge of actually making a building.
You mentioned one of your buildings took 8 years to build. What was that?
Yeah. That was a building that was a cultural centre in this in the UK, and actually, it's not quite right. It took 8 years, the journey from start to finish, and that was a building that was initiated by 4 women who moved back to their town they grew up in, and they wanted to use a building to make change in this place. And they spent, many years working out how a building would be part of that process of change. What is it the building needed to do? How could it bring a community with it? What spaces did it need to provide for its community? All of those kind of things. They then raised, £7 or £8 million, and we then built the building. But for an architect to be part of that journey really early on, before we know what the building was going to be, talking to a community, was it this? Was it that? Did they like this? Did they like that? How could we work with them? How could we help them imagine a better future? And how could a building be part of that? Was really, really interesting. But other buildings typically take, even the most straightforward building we do takes 3 years, I would say. A year designing it and planning it, maybe 6 months, documenting it for construction, then maybe a year and a half building. It's a really long process, and TV is so quick. You can make a film in a day, and that's really, really interesting, I think.
But what's the benefit for you, like going on TV and all? Like, is it just for fun or just?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I have a love-hate relationship with TV. I'm not really doing much TV at the moment. I might do in the future. I'm making one film at the moment that's taken quite a long time because it's a very different way of making a film compared to the stuff I did, say, with Netflix or the BBC. I think as I get older, my priorities have changed, and now I want to make really good TV and really thorough TV and really authentic TV, which I can control. And when I say I can control, I don't mean I control every bit of it, but just means that I can bring an authentic self to that TV. So we're making to that TV show. So we're making a film about Jørn Utzon, who is an amazing Danish architect that designed the Sydney Opera House. We're making a film about his journey from Sydney to Mallorca, where he went after Sydney, and the house that he then designed and lived in for much of the rest of his life. And what I really enjoy about it is that, I discover a different world because I have to find out about this world as I'm making this thing. I see a different place, and it also teaches me a great deal. I learn a great deal about design in many ways, and it challenges many of the things that I think about design, and ultimately I hope makes me a better designer. Like if you take the building that we're making a film about at the moment, that's this house called Can Lis in Mallorca. It's such an interesting building because in a way it's a kind of modern icon, and yet it's so much better than a modern icon because of how Utzon designed it, the drawings he did, the process he went through working with local collaborators, the modifications he made during the time it was being built, and then the modifications he made 20 years later. It's such a sort of rich story that it makes me raise my game, I think. And the more good design I see, the more I have to raise my own game. But I also, I'm someone that likes lots of stimulation, and actually sitting in a studio designing buildings here, in a way, wouldn't be enough. I love to get out and see the world, meet people, and see new buildings, have new experiences, and see the world through the lens of architecture.
So the existing TV shows that you've released, where can people watch them?
So I think they're all on YouTube and on Netflix and maybe in the BBC archive. And I have to confess, I haven't seen all of them because for me, the fun is in the making of them, not in the watching of them. So once I've made a TV show, I typically never see it. But the new one, we will, hopefully that will be on Netflix too. But it's still a few months off finishing it because the producer and the director are such perfectionists, which is really exciting.
Is that, are you a perfectionist yourself?
Yes, but not in a way that many people think perfectionists work. So many people think of perfectionists as hyper controlling, whereas I think that I love the messiness of the journey, the creative journey, and I love to immerse myself in the unknown that is a creative journey and work constantly in the moment with whatever is around me. And in that sense, I very much am a perfectionist because I want everything to be the best it can possibly be. My frustration with making the TV that I made, like The World's Most Extraordinary Homes, was that, I'd travel and do a, shoot, and then somebody would put it together in an edit studio miles away that I never met, had no idea what kind of story I was trying to tell. I had no control over the final, sort of narrative. And that was really frustrating. So I think in some senses, I am a perfectionist, but not in the way that many people think that perfectionists work. Like, for example, sometimes if I'm involved in a project that's on site, like a building, and a contractor or a builder makes a mistake, many people might think, well, I'm really going to, go and play hardball with that guy and get him to redo it, whatever it is. Sometimes I think, well, actually, that mistake might make the building more beautiful. We could actually learn from this and, incorporate that mistake. So I think, yes, I'm a perfectionist, but I would like to come at it with a really open mind about a different way of making perfect things and challenging what perfection actually means.
You decided to move out of the city and move with your family into the woods. Can you talk about that difference? What is it like to live in a city compared to you could say a forest in the middle of nowhere?
So I lived in Sydney when I was a student, and it was amazing. I lived there in the early 90s, and I really loved living in Sydney. I went there to study, so I didn't grow up in Sydney. I grew up in the UK, and when I went to live in Sydney, I loved it because it was a city that was a reasonably sized city. It's capital city. It was not, sorry, it's not a capital city, actually. It's a large international city that felt that it had a kind of scale, and it felt like an urban place. And at the same time, it had a really wild landscape that it sat in. It was a hilly landscape, a rocky landscape, and a coastal landscape. And those two things coming together, I thought were amazing. And then I moved back after about 5 or 6 years to London. And I really hated living in London because I never felt I had a sense of the geography of the city unless I went down to the river. As no, it's generally a flat city, very few high points. You can't ever get a perspective on it. And unlike Sydney, where you constantly have a perspective on where you are because it's sort of so up and down, and all these points and fingers that go into the harbour. And London, in a way does have that, but it's very subtle. And the buildings there meant that you couldn't read any of that. You couldn't see any of that. And I did feel very disconnected from the natural world. London felt like a place that was sort of isolating me from the rest of the world. All I could see was a sort of manufactured landscape. So I moved out of London then, moved about an hour outside London, and just, quite quickly, we wanted to move closer to a cosmopolitan city because we wanted the best bits of the city, the culture of the city, the fabric of the city that we could go to when we needed to. But at the same time, we wanted to be in a place that was really connected to the natural world. And in a way, you kind of, I remember you sort of fall into things. I remember about that, this time just before we moved here, I'd gone back to Australia to see the people I'd studied with. And I'd gone to this extraordinary house in Sydney, just north of Sydney, designed by a guy called Richard Le Plastrier, who's another extraordinary Australian architect. And it was the most empowering house I've ever been to. It's in terms of what it empowered me to do and the change it empowered me to make in my own life. And it was a house that they lived in that was so kind of raw and beautiful and connected to its environment. The whole house just opened up in a really unusual. Everything opened up, every wall, everything opened up. It's just this kind of platform and shelter in the most primeval way next to the harbour north of Sydney. And I was, and I think the building itself was the furniture. You sat, the building just stepped down, and you used the building in a really unconventional way, and it sort of challenged everything that I knew about buildings, and it was so sort of encompassing of life that, I really wanted to live. It really made me aware that I needed to live in a much more, in a way that was much more connected to nature. And then, we just saw. We were just, I guess, living in a normal house in a kind of small town, and then we saw this tiny little, piece of land with a little building on it, advertised in our local paper, and I thought, I've really got to go and see this. And when we went to see it, or I went to see it, one of my daughters was, 7 days old. I remember carrying her down here with the real estate agent down this path through this woodland. And I thought, my God, that journey is so magical. And as the path got longer and longer, I was aware that, fewer and fewer people will want to buy this. And when we opened the gate and I saw this incredible view with this building, I just said, yeah, we'll buy it. And she was like, don't you want to go inside? And I was like, no, I'm good. This is where I need to be here. I just have the strongest urge to be here that I've ever had. And so we bought the house and we moved in. And then 2 years later, we needed more space. So then we built, the house that we still live in. And then some years later, we then managed to buy the whole woodlands, which changed everything. So in a way, yes, I really needed to be here, but also we've just ended up sort of just, gradually acquiring more space and land. And then I think one of the things it really gave me was freedom to build our own buildings and experiment and use, because we had the luxury of space. Britain is a small island with relatively little space where land is expensive. I had the luxury of space that I could experiment in my teaching. I could invite people here, but experiment in how we built what we built, because usually, one of the things that you do as an architect is you just build what someone asks you to build. But actually having space was really interesting because it allowed me to experiment and use the woodland for our own experiments, to build stuff. If we didn't have any work or didn't have any, no one was asking us to do things, we could just build stuff and experiment. And that was an incredible luxury as an architect, to have that space to just innovate and test ideas. So that's what I get. I guess I get from being here, And I think then just to see the seasons, to see everything change, it's always different. And I think in a rural context, the difference is so much more extreme than in a urban place where typically the day-to-day is sort of mitigated by the lens of a conditioned environment.
Yeah, that's something I wish to do in my lifetime as well. I want to be with nature. I want to move out, but you have to be in the city to build a career and whatnot.
Of
So
course. It's really hard. And I think, when I started, there was no culture of people living and working outside of London. So 20 something years, 25 years ago, whatever it was, everyone worked in London. And I, was the first person I knew that was an architect that was trying to do interesting things that moved out of the city. But what I had up my sleeve was the knowledge of how Glenn Murcutt had worked, because he'd lived in the city, but he'd gone out in the bush to make amazing buildings, and he'd seen the landscape differently. So coming back here, what I didn't see was a sort of provincial rural landscape. I saw an amazing place that was just so interesting that I wanted to embed myself in and work in. So it was, again, coming back to Glenn. I mean, he gave me so much.
what's the future for you? Like, what do you plan next?
I don't know. I think I'm really excited by the future, but I don't want it to be a rerun of my past. I want new challenges, new things, new people, new experiences, new ways of doing architecture. And I feel at the moment I'm at a kind of intersection where I'm trying to relinquish and relearn, relinquish ways of being and ways of knowing, and learn new things. So at the moment, I feel I've just got my antenna and my radar out looking for new things.
Like, how do you make sure that happens though? Aren't you just leaving it up for luck or something?
I think, yes, that's a very interesting question again. How do you make sure it happens? I think, my wife has this expression that you have to get off one bus before the next bus comes along. And I think if you leave yourself open to things, they come along. You trust that something will come along. And in a way, I feel that for much of my life, I've sort of planned the next phase, and I've had an idea about a way of working and an idea about something, and I've set things up and then, work within those structures. I think as I get older, I feel that actually, if I relax those structures and allow myself to be open to what might come along, to a certain extent, there's a little bit of luck involved. But I think things are all around us. And if we are open to them, we discover them and we see them, and then we seize them and make the most of them.
Yeah, that's all from my side. Could you just, one last question, could you just give some advice for the people living in cities and all? Should they consider moving out or?
I don't think so. I think that cities are the future because cities allow, you know, most of the population to live on a tiny footprint and share resources. And that's the future of the planet in some ways. And one of the things I think that cities are so good at is the sharing of resources. And I think, cities are really stimulating places where people come together, and all those chance encounters you have with other people that you get within a city are the lifeblood for many people of existence. And I think that cities are so rich and so interesting. I mean, to a certain extent, I've sort of ended up here, but actually, maybe the next step for me is to move back to a city. Maybe I should move to a really dense cosmopolitan city and be part of that great mass of people all sharing resources and living on a tiny footprint. I don't know. I think cities are amazing places, and I think cities are really good for us.
I don't think you're gonna move to London though.
Not to London.
Right. But what city do you think is doing this quite well, incorporating, the hustle of the city and nature as well?
Well, I think New York is an amazing city. I think New York's, I mean, New York is an amazing city because it's an incredibly dense city that has really amazing wild spaces. And to a certain extent, that's, Central Park, which is an amazing piece of landscape within the middle of a city. But I think it's also just the river that's around it, where you're constantly connected to this really powerful natural force. And it's a city that is a highly natural city that's also an exemplar in terms of allowing many, many people to live on a tiny footprint, surrounded by culture and ideas and stimulation and all those sorts of things. And I have a lot of family that live there, and I'm talking to somebody about maybe teaching at Columbia there, which could be, my future. So I think New York is an amazing city for those reasons. But I'm also really in love with cities in Southern Europe, and I'd be quite happy living in a dense, French city, near the Atlantic coast, perhaps. Just, seeing the public spaces filled with life. But actually the future of the world is in places like India, where are changing more than any country has ever changed in the history of the world in a single or two generations, going from, what is a rural population into actually being able to invent, the cities of the future. And that is where I'd like to be working, I think, perhaps in the middle band of the world through Asia. That would be really exciting.
What have you seen about India though? Like, what makes you say that?
Well, I've been to India, of course, and I've been when I was 17, many years ago, and I've been relatively recently. And what makes me say that is that if you look at the old world, if I look at Europe, Europe hasn't changed much in many generations. The cities are relatively stable in population, and although there's a sort of gradual move off the land as we change the way that we use land, in India, for example, we've seen the greatest rate of change of the greatest mobilization of population as it's moved from typically a rural agricultural population into the city, which has happened in two or three generations. So if we look at the world from about 1890 to about 10 years ago, I think it was, we went from 2% urbanized to 50% urbanized. And in the next 25 years, we'll go to 80% urbanized. Most of that change is happening in the central band of the world, typically in Asia, India, and possibly Africa, where cities are going from 5,000 to 5 million to 50 million in two generations. That's kind of unheard of. And that's really amazing, because what we really need to do is make sure those cities are fit for purpose. and fit for purpose in an environmental sense and fit for purpose in a social sense. And that's a very, very exciting opportunity. If I look at the cities in the old world, London is pretty stable in terms of its population. It hasn't changed much in 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, and it probably won't change that much in the next 30 or 40 years. The cities that I'm talking about in India are changing massively, and it's a really interesting architectural challenge. So that's, I think, why it's so interesting, because there's real issues to solve, real issues to grapple with. How do you provide environments for people to thrive when things are changing so quickly?
Yeah, that's an accurate description of what's happening in India right now, because you can see that people are moving to the cities like crazy, and it's actually putting strain on the city's infrastructure and all the other things like that. So luckily, India is quite large. There are quite a lot of cities that people can choose. India is quite spread out, and people have lots of options. So it's not gonna collapse or anything. Yeah, cool. So thanks for the insight and thank you for your time, man.
Pleasure. Thanks so much. Really nice to meet you.